today is Islam, Evolution and Darwinism, delivered by Subboor Ahmad. So a bit more about the speaker. Subboor Ahmad is an iERA outreach specialist, iERA standing for Islamic Education Research Academy, and is a well-known public speaker and writer. He has discussed and debated prominent academics on philosophy and science, and is currently pursuing postgraduate studies in philosophy. He has a particular interest in the philosophy of biology and is specialising in this field. In terms of the talk today, the talk will discuss the following concepts: the relationship between science and certainty, why Darwinian theory is based upon a probabilistic framework, why its assumptions are beginning to be challenged, Darwinism as a religious and ethical system, and the Islamic stance on Darwinian theory. Now, before we go any further, I would like to introduce Subboor Ahmad to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you all. Am I supposed to be doing that? I'm going to start as Muslims do. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. In the name of God, and peace and blessing be upon all of His messengers. So today's talk is called Islam, Evolution and Darwinism. The first thing which I'd like to cover actually is this image. Now, the way I want this talk to be is I want to sort of not focus too much on the slides, not focus too much on because I know you guys are students, and the last thing you want at 6 o'clock on the evening is to have another lecture. So I'm going to try and go through this as quick as I can, and I really want to focus on the Q&A because I think that's where most of the learning is done. So put your hands up if you've seen this image or something like this before. Okay, that's pretty much everyone unless you live in Cornwall. So if you've had any sort of interaction with the civilized aspects of humanity or any marketing, you would know of this image, and you would know that actually this is probably the most iconic image when it comes to evolution. In fact, when you think of Coca-Cola, you think of, what do you think of? What color? Red. And Santa used to be? Anyone know? Green. There you go. Santa used to be green until the capitalists turned him into red. Now, red and white stripy logo of Coca-Cola, that's very famous. That's like, a icon of Coca-Cola. Likewise, this is an icon of Darwin's theory. Whenever we want to think about Darwin's theory, we think of something like this. Now, what's interesting is although most people in this room have seen this image, what's probably going to come as a surprise to you is that this is not the way the theory actually works. There isn't this progression from an ape-like creature to a human-like creature, that evolution works in this linear progressive way. Now, the first thing that's going to happen to somebody who's hearing that for the first time is, wait, hang on. You're telling me all these marketeers with all those adverts to do with cars evolving and all the rest of these sort of images that we get, that they're actually using a false narrative on Darwin's theory? The answer is actually yes, they are. What's interesting about this example is it highlights the difference between the public understanding of the theory of evolution and the academic understanding, and this is a wider problem when it comes to generally the popular perception of science and the actual academic understanding of science. Now, what we're going to be covering today is the relationship between science and certainty, the current state of Darwin's theory of evolution, God and Darwinian evolution, why Darwin's theory is unique in the history of science, which is very important, and a little bit about Islam and science. So first, whoever I'm going to be referring to today, these are not going to be creationists or intelligent design proponents. They're going to be mainstream secular academics, and I'm going to be referring to mainstream peer-reviewed journals. Now, before we talk about Darwin's theory is a product of science, so we need to talk about science. Now, anyone like to summarize what is science defined as? Imagine you didn't see this. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than this. Who wants to be brave? And yes?
Testable and observable.
Testable and observable, yes. What else? Apart from being tested, yes.
Reproducible.
Reproducible.
based on empirical data.
Based on empirical data. Yep.
It tries to answer questions.
Tries to answer questions. Yep. Okay. Something else which is missing maybe.
Make theories that can be falsified.
Makes theories that can be falsified. Fantastic. So we've got a general idea of what science is. However, when you look at the philosophy of science, which is like a meta level, so you've got scientists who's like working away at and studying bacteria. The bacteria are the subjects that the scientist is trying to study. Now, if you imagine there's a philosopher in the corner there who's studying the scientist. So the scientist is the subject for the philosophers. That's the difference between the philosophy of science and science. Now, although this is a very popular idea of the way that science actually works, there's no clear consensus on what exactly science is. There's a whole problem about demarcation and whether observation comes first or hypothesis comes first and so on and so forth. But generally we have an idea of what we're speaking about. Okay, why is science amazing? Because it works. So we can go to the moon based upon science, and if you were to make a prediction, say using Newton's model of the universe, and you're to say, okay, where's this planet going to be in 6 months' time from now? And you're to make a prediction, okay, it's going to be there in 6 months' time, and then you go out and you make the observation after 6 months, you will realize it is in fact there. So science works, which is why it's amazing. Now, although it works and it's fantastic and we use science all the time, and in fact for you to get to university here, you've interacted with science throughout your day, with the products of science, we need to understand what science is based upon and what makes it amazing. Now, one of the things which makes science amazing is not only that it works, is that it can fundamentally change. It can radically change. And one of the reasons for that is what's known as an ancient problem, not ancient, more like that. Yeah, it is a bit of an old problem. It's known as the problem of induction, first highlighted by David Hume a couple of hundred years ago. So imagine you're a scientist and you want to find out what are the colour of swans in Sheffield, say 200-300 years ago. And you were to go out and observe 1,000 swans, 2,000 swans, 3,000 swans and document. You'd see that, okay, these swans that I've seen are white, therefore the next swan, which I'm going to see, is going to be white, or I'm going to make a general statement that all swans are white. So you've gone from a limited set of observations to a general conclusion. The issue with that is that you can come across a black swan, which then challenges your theory. Now this problem, which is known as the problem of induction, or the black swan problem, is something which is at the very heart of the scientific method. So no matter how much a theory's been confirmed and it's worked well, there's always a risk that in the future you can have a novel observation which can challenge your previous conclusion. Secondly, there is another problem in the philosophy of science, which is why theories can change radically, and this is known as underdetermination of theory by observation. I'm just going to call it a scattergraph problem because it sounds nicer. So you've got a scattergraph, you've got some dots on there, and you're asked, okay, do you know what? Make a line of best fit. So some of you are going to make like a straight linear line, the boring one of you, and some are going to make like a curve, some are going to make like a sine curve. Either way, you get the point. The same observations can give rise to different theories. So because of these two reasons, science changes. And that's just not only true in terms of evolutionary theory, that's just true in terms of the history of science. And this is a reason why any scientific theory we can't just take for granted. And again, this is a massive difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. The popular understanding is science is there to give you proof, to give you facts, to give you unchangeable theories, but that's not the way that science actually works. Now, what doesn't obviously change are observations. So you've seen the fossil of a trilobite, you've seen the shape of the Earth, unless, is there a Flat Earth Society at this university? Is there? No, I was actually being serious. The Flat Earthers are getting like really popular and stuff. In fact, I met a guy who's a flat earther who's got he studied physics at UCL. I mean, these guys aren't dumb. Like, every argument you give them, they give you a counter argument. Have you not come across flat earthers yet? But do you think slowly? They must be hiding in the south. They're not brave enough to come on board. Anyway, so the shape of the Earth. Let's take it that we all agree it's round. Fossils existing, want to be H2O. So these observations obviously don't change, but science is more than observations. Science is when you make an inference based upon observations. So the observations themselves are not going to change regardless of what we're going to view in the future, but the theories that are based upon them can do so. Now, a classical example is of a massive change in a theory is from the Newtonian model to the Einsteinian model. Now, like I said before, Newton's model worked really well for like 200 years, right? So you could make a precise prediction, where's this planet going to be, and it was found to be there. However, Einstein came along and he basically flipped the whole script. He said, you know what, we're going to have to change the definition of mass. So going back to Newton using all these fantastic equations and making himself look really clever and getting right predictions, and Einstein's going to come along and basically scribble that out and say, no, the way you define mass is actually wrong, although your results were correct and your predictions were confirmed. Time and space is no longer fixed. It's actually flexible. It's like fabric. It's like cloth, right? So he completely changed with his general relativity the Newtonian model, although it worked well for 200 years. Likewise, theories work even when they're wrong. So we can still go to other planets based upon Newtonian mechanics. We discovered, I'm sure university students like yourselves have cars like these. So, the nitrogen boosters in your cars, nitrogen was discovered using the theory of phlogiston, a theory in chemistry which turned out to be completely false, although the element of nitrogen we know to be real. Theories work even when they contradict each other. So here in Sheffield, you'll have a physics department, I'm hoping, and in the physics department, you're going to have people who subscribe to general relativity, people who subscribe to quantum mechanics, and they'll subscribe to both, although fundamentally they contradict each other at a assumption level. So, use this Hansen book. This is some whose name I've forgotten, I'm going to go over the quote now. Any philosophy of science book that you pick up generally speaks about the fact that when you look at a historical perspective, when you look at science from a historical perspective, you find that there's revolutions, there's changes, there's paradigm shifts. But when you look at it at the micro level, at the granular level, it's more like it looks static. So any book on the philosophy of science will say something like this. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false that were empirically quite successful. And I just remembered his name. His name is Larry Loudon. He's a philosopher of science who he's put together an amazing philosophical argument based on historical data of really powerful, empirically successful theories which turned out to be false. Likewise, and this is again a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding, even the terms we use in terms of the layman, right? We say, oh, there's no scientific proof for that, right? Now look at this statement. Science is revisable, meaning it can change. Hence, talk of scientific proof is dangerous because the term fosters the idea of conclusions that are graven in stone. So again, there's a big difference between the public and academic understanding. Now, even really ardent Darwinists like the Oxford professor Richard Dawkins, he says this in one of his lesser-known works. We must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. Which problem in the philosophy of science is he referring to right now? Black swan or scattered off? Black swan. He's basically saying, look, you can always get a new fact which can challenge what we previously held, and even within the field of evolutionary biology, within even Darwinism. Now, there is a lot of, and I'm going to go in the end in terms of the propaganda, why the difference between the public and the academic differences actually exists. It's not just a coincidence, There is obviously a public and an academic misunderstanding when it comes to science in general, but here there's something more going on. But anyway, assume you are in front of a hardcore Darwinist who is basically saying, do you know what? Darwin's theory is not just a valid scientific theory, it is actually something that we know to be true, literally. So he's speaking way beyond what academia says. So say he's making this argument, and he says, you know what? Whether you look at biochemistry, or genetics, or anatomy, or psychology, or linguistics, or bioinformatics, or biogeography, or the fossil record, or whatever, all of these fields converge to prove that Darwin was actually right and is beyond dispute. And also, and this is an argument which is actually made, is that Darwin's theory has decisively shown that there's no creator. Right? God's out the window now. Now, if somebody comes up with an argument like that, even before we get into the evolution side of things, you can simply challenge that based on a few points. So the first point you can make is that the idea there's something in science that can challenge the existence of God or disprove God is assuming that science has that capacity, or science is set up to actually do that, and that's obviously false, and we can discuss that. Secondly, that we have the black swan problem, that look, even though you believe a theory to be true, and even let's assume that this theory does challenge the existence of God, although we're saying that that's not the case, but let's assume it does. Even in that case, that can be challenged by the black swan problem, or the problem of the scatter graph problem. On top of that, another layer of problems is that Darwin's theory, as it's understood today, has these three components which are undeniable. So there's no evolutionary paleontologist, biologist, chemist, or whatever in the world that would deny these three aspects of Darwin's theory. The first aspect is that it's based on a probabilistic framework. The second is that it has assumptions, and some of these assumptions are challenged by other evolutionary biologists. And lastly, there are disputes still existing amongst its most fundamental core ideas. So firstly, again, there's a difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding. From a layman's perspective, from a pedestrian point of view, evolution and Darwinism is the same thing, right? Evolution and Darwinism is the same thing. There's no point differentiating between the two. However, there is a difference. And the difference we get, even if we look at it from a historical point of view. So whenever people think of evolution, they think of Darwin. Or whenever Darwin's theory is being mentioned, they think of evolution. However, to divorce the two, let's begin off with this. Evolution's been written about, philosophized about, theorized about for at least 3,000 years of human history. Darwin only came along about 150 years ago. So clearly, evolution as a concept existed before Darwin. So evolution as a basic concept means biological change over time. That's what it basically means. It's not theologically toxic. It's not something, that was highly controversial before Darwin. Darwin did something very different. Darwin came along and proposed two twin ideas. He gave a history of evolution and he gave a mechanism of evolution. The history of evolution he gave is that all of life on Earth converges back to a single point. And it branches out like this tree. So, human beings, apes, butterflies, grasshoppers, elephants, Lady Gagas, all of us go back to a common ancestor. That's the first history. And the mechanism by which this is done is natural selection. So he has these two ideas. Evolution simply means biological change over time. Because these two things get convoluted, when somebody says, okay, so why do we believe the tree of life is true? Or why do we believe that I have a common ancestor with, fish, whatever? The answer that's given is in terms of, well, bacteria mutate, or we've done this Kettlebell's moth experiment. So the answer is given in context of evolution, although the question is about Darwin's theory of evolution, Darwinism. And this is known as a fallacy of equivocation. So what's your name? Abdurrahman. So Abdurrahman, he keels over, starts to die. I'm like, oh my God, is there a doctor in the house? And the sister in the black hijab comes forward and says, I'm a doctor. I'm like, yeah, can you help him out? She's like, I've got a PhD in philosophy. I'm like, no, a doctor, a medical doctor, right? Can you see what's happening here? It's two different terms. Medical doctor and a PhD in philosophy, which is useless. I can say. No, because I'm studying philosophy. It's not useless. It depends how you define useless. You can always defend yourself if you study philosophy. Okay. Now, probabilistic framework. Why is Darwin's theory based on a probabilistic framework? Here's a simple pedestrian view for why it is based on a probabilistic framework. War and Peace, a book I'm sure you've never heard of as university students. This is one of the, I think 70,000 words or whatever. It's a really, really big book. Not 70,000 words, I think 500,000 words, sorry, 500,000 words, right? So it's a really, really big book. And the analogy that's given in a scientific journal about working out the history of life is like having Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace book given to you, and only 13 randomly selected pages have writing, and all the rest of the pages are blank, and you're supposed to work out the history, or sorry, the rest of the story using those 13 pages. So you have those 13 pages, and I give the book to every single person here. I'm sure you're going to come up with contradictory stories and themes. And this is the analogy given of trying to work out the history of human evolution. Secondly, another issue is it's not just a scatter graph, it's a scatter graph on steroids, or in the context of university students, monkey dust. And the reason for this is that if you look at the history of life, according to the National Science Foundation, 99.999% of life is unobserved. So we don't have fossils, we don't have the genetic data, we don't have the information for 99.999% of life on Earth. That life has expired, it's gone. So everything that we're doing today in terms of the phylogenetic history of life is based on an inference of 0.0001%. So it's a scatter graph on steroids. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And we're speaking about not something which happened 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. We're speaking about the beginning of life, which is assumed to be around 4 billion years ago. So trying to work out the history of life and trying to work out a theory which tries to give a comprehensive explanation of this is always going to be incredibly difficult. Then there's also the problem that other evolutionary biologists, because they obviously aren't like evil people who are trying to get people to disbelieve in God and trying to get them to believe in a theory which literally, rather than just being a valid scientific theory, they are going to raise questions eventually. So for example, one of the things that we hear a lot is, how did this trait evolve? How did the human bipedalism, or human intelligence, or human this, or human that evolve? And there's always a story that's actually being told. Well, what might have happened was, in terms of our ancestors, is this and that, and so there's always stories going on. Now, people like Richard Lewontin, he's an atheist evolutionary biologist from Harvard. Him and Stephen Jay Gould, about 40 years ago, they wrote this paper, The Spandrels of St. Marco in the Panglossian Paradigm, whatever, and they basically were saying, look, you can't just give a story in the past based on natural selection and say, okay, that's it, our job's done, right? Because if you look at a lot of documentaries, even if you go home tonight and you put in between playing Minecraft and Candy Crush and all the rest, you basically just go online and you put in some documentary on evolution. You're going to get, okay, so how did a human being evolve this? And then you'll get a story. What they're saying is, look, you can't just give stories. You need to give some sort of data to back that up. You need to give some